Hannah Cade wasn't sure why she'd signed up for the program. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe boredom. Or maybe it was just her way of breaking up the monotony of a life spent tinkering with planetary mining drones and reading books about adventures she'd never have. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't a hero, wasn't even the sort of person who made big, bold moves. Yet here she was, standing in line at the Coalition Military Outreach Terminal, clutching a flimsy package of cookies and a handwritten note, hoping it wasn't all too embarrassing. The Thank a Soldier initiative had popped up a year ago. Civilians were encouraged to send care packages and notes of appreciation to the soldiers stationed at distant outposts, particularly on the rough edges of the galaxy. Some people sent heartfelt letters, others sent homemade trinkets or useful supplies. Hannah had settled for chocolate chip cookies, the least she could manage considering her baking skills, and a note that read, "To whoever gets this, thank you for protecting us out there. It's easy to forget how much you all sacrifice while we live our normal lives. You're incredible. Stay safe and maybe one day I'll get to thank you in person. Hannah K." It wasn't Shakespeare, but it felt genuine. She figured some tired soldier could use a cookie and a kind word. What she didn't expect was for it to matter. The cookies had made their way across several light years to Outpost Epsilon 7, a military installation near the Rift. The Rift wasn't exactly a tourist destination. It was a swirling, ever-changing tear in space-time that spat out trouble more often than not. Pirates, hostile aliens, and cosmic anomalies made it one of the most dangerous zones in the galaxy. The Coalition's forces there were stretched thin, constantly fighting fires, sometimes literally. Her package ended up in the hands of Staff Sergeant Nate Drake, a no-nonsense soldier with scars on his knuckles and a cynical streak a mile wide. Drake wasn't the kind of guy who believed in miracles or random acts of kindness. He'd been out there too long, seen too much. But when he opened the box and read the note, something shifted. He didn't smile. Nate Drake didn't smile, but he did stop for a moment. Just a moment, long enough to think about what it meant for someone out there to care. The cookies were shared among his squad, the note tucked into his vest pocket. When a skirmish broke out 2 weeks later, the Rift erupted into chaos. A strange new enemy poured through, a biomechanical swarm unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Soldiers at Epsilon 7 fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. Desperate, Drake transmitted a distress signal before the base was overrun. The signal found its way back to Coalition Command and then, bizarrely, to Hannah Cade. She'd been working in her workshop, repairing a finicky mining drone when the call came through. It wasn't a hologram or a direct transmission. It was just a garbled message routed through layers of encryption and damaged relays. Yet somehow her name was unmistakable. Hannah K. Neat. Rift spreading, coordinates attached. Please? It was Nate Drake's voice. Hannah froze, heart hammering. It had to be a mistake. Prank even. Soldiers didn't call civilians for help, especially not random civilians like her. But the coordinates were real and they painted a grim picture. The Rift was expanding, swallowing space at an alarming rate. Whatever had come through wasn't content to stay in one place. It was spreading. Panic flickered in her chest. She was just a drone mechanic. What could she possibly do? She wasn't even sure how to contact the military to report the message. Still, the sound of his voice haunted her. It wasn't just a plea for help, it was personal. She tried to shake it off, returning to her drones. But the message lingered, gnawing at her. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she made a decision that shocked even herself. She was going. Hannah didn't have a ship of her own, but she knew someone who did. Her best friend, Jax, was a rogue smuggler with questionable ethics and a knack for getting into trouble. When she showed up at his dockyard hangar the next morning, his reaction was predictably incredulous. "You want to go where?" Jax asked, leaning against the hull of his battered freighter, the Star Stray. "To the Rift? Are you insane?" "It's important," she insisted. "People are dying out there. And what, you think you're going to save them? With what cookies?" She glared at him, heat rising to her cheeks. "I don't know what I'm going to do, okay? But I can't just sit here. I have to try." Jax sighed, running a hand through his unruly hair. "You're going to get yourself killed. And me probably." "Then don't come," she shot back. "But I'm going either way." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head with a rueful smile. "You're impossible, you know that? Fine. But if we die, I'm haunting you." Within hours, they were airborne, hurtling toward the coordinates from the message. The journey wasn't easy. The closer they got to the Rift, the more unstable space became. Gravity warped unpredictably, sensors malfunctioned, and strange pulses of energy rattled the Star Stray. Jax cursed constantly, wrestling with the controls, while Hannah sat in the co-pilot's seat, clutching the armrests and trying not to vomit. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace near the rift, the sight took her breath away. It was massive, a churning vortex of light and darkness that seemed to devour everything around it. Ships floated in the debris field, some intact, others shattered. And beyond them the swarm. The biomechanical creatures were unlike anything Hannah had ever seen. They moved like a school of fish, sleek and efficient, with metallic bodies and organic tendrils. They weren't just attacking, they were building something using the wreckage of the ships they destroyed. "What the hell is that?" Jax muttered, his voice low. "I don't know," Hannah whispered. Her stomach twisted at the sight. This wasn't just a battle, it was an invasion. As they hovered on the outskirts of the battlefield, a weak signal crackled through their comms. "If anyone's out there, this is Staff Sergeant Drake, survivors on Delta Station. Need assistance?" Hannah's heart leapt. He was alive. "We have to go," she said urgently. "Go where?" Jax snapped. "Into that? You're crazy." "Jax, please," she begged. "He's out there. People are out there. We can't just leave them." He groaned, slamming a fist against the console. "Fine. But if we die, I'm blaming you." With that, the Star Stray surged forward, diving into the chaos. Hannah's grip on the armrest tightened as they weaved through the debris field, dodging both wreckage and hostile fire. Jax was cursing up a storm, his piloting skills pushed to the limit. The swarm took notice of them, several of the creatures breaking off to pursue. "Do something," Jax yelled as the ship shook violently. "I'm not a gunner," she shouted back, panic rising. "Then learn fast." Hannah scrambled to the weapons console, fumbling with the unfamiliar controls. She managed to fire off a few shots, more by luck than skill, and one of the creatures exploded in a shower of sparks. "Nice shot," Jax gritted out, though his tone was far from congratulatory. They broke through the worst of the swarm and spotted Delta Station, a small, heavily damaged installation clinging to life on the edge of the rift. Hannah's heart pounded as they approached, the enormity of what she was doing finally sinking in. This wasn't a game. This wasn't some grand adventure like in the stories she read. This was real, and it was terrifying. As the Star Stray docked with the station, the comms crackled again. "Whoever you are, you just bought yourself a whole lot of trouble," Drake's voice came through, weary but alive. "But thanks for showing up." Hannah swallowed hard, steeling herself. "Don't thank me yet," she muttered. The airlock hissed open, and for the first time she came face to face with Staff Sergeant Nate Drake. He looked exactly like she'd imagined, grizzled, tough, and not at all amused. But there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes as he saw her. "You're Hannah Cade?" he asked incredulously. She nodded, her voice trembling. "Yeah. I'm here to help." Drake shook his head, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Lady, I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." The inside of Delta Station was barely holding together. Dim emergency lights flickered across the narrow corridors, and the air reeked of burnt metal, ozone, and something acrid that made Hannah gag. Bulkheads had been hastily welded shut in some places, while others hung open, exposing jagged edges of twisted metal. The faint hum of life support systems sounded like the labored breathing of a dying animal. Staff Sergeant Nate Drake moved like he belonged in the chaos, his boots crunching over debris as he led the way. His rifle was slung low but ready, and his eyes flicked toward every shadow, every flicker of movement. Behind him, Hannah and Jax followed awkwardly, the smuggler grumbling under his breath about the terrible life choices that had brought him there. "Where's the rest of your team?" Hannah asked, her voice quieter than she'd intended. Drake didn't stop walking. "Dead. Or worse." Her stomach sank. "Worse?" He cast a glance back at her, his expression hard. "Captured. Those things don't just kill, they take. Assimilate?" The word hung in the air like a curse. "What do you mean, assimilate?" Jax asked, his tone uneasy. Drake stopped and turned to face them. In the dim light, the lines on his face looked deeper, etched by years of war and too little sleep. "Those biomechanical bastards," he said, jabbing a finger toward the direction of the rift, "they don't just destroy. They convert. Whatever tech or organic material they come across, they repurpose it. People included. That's why they're here, to scavenge, to grow. Every ship they bring down, every station they hit, every soldier they capture. They're not just enemies. They're resources." Hannah felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. She could picture it too clearly, living beings torn apart, rebuilt into something monstrous. "So why haven't you been converted?" Jax asked, the skepticism thick in his voice. "Because I've been too busy blowing them up," Drake snapped. Before Jax could argue further, the sound of a distant metallic screech cut through the station, echoing like a blade drawn across steel. Everyone froze. Movement, Drake muttered, raising his rifle. Stay behind me. Hannah's heart pounded as she clutched the small blaster Jax had given her before docking. It felt absurdly small in her hands, as though it couldn't possibly do anything against the horrors that awaited them. The screech came again, louder this time. Shadows shifted in the hallway ahead, and then they emerged, two of them biomechanical monstrosities that moved with an eerie, fluid grace. Their bodies were a fusion of jagged metal and sinewy organic matter, their glowing red eyes locked onto the group. Run, Drake barked, leveling his rifle. Hannah hesitated for half a second too long, and Drake shoved her toward Jax. I said run. The creatures surged forward, faster than anything their size had a right to be. Drake fired in controlled bursts, the corridor lighting up with each shot. The first creature staggered, sparks flying as rounds tore into its torso, but it didn't stop. Jax grabbed Hannah's arm, dragging her down a side passage. Come on, hero. Move. She stumbled after him, her pulse hammering in her ears. Behind them, the sound of gunfire and the mechanical screeches of the creatures filled the air. Is he going to be okay? She panted. If he's half as tough as he looks, yeah, Jax said grimly. If not, we're screwed anyway. They skidded to a halt as the passage dead-ended at a sealed bulkhead. Jax cursed, frantically scanning the control panel. Of course. Why wouldn't it be locked? Can you hack it? I'm not a miracle worker. Hannah shoved him aside, her hands trembling as she pulled a multi-tool from her belt. This she knew, machines, wiring, circuits. Her fingers worked quickly, prying open the panel and exposing the mess of wires beneath. Hurry up, Jax hissed, glancing back down the corridor. I'm trying. Behind them, the gunfire stopped. Hannah's stomach churned. Either Drake had run out of ammo or... She refused to finish the thought, focusing instead on the task in front of her. The wiring was a mess, but she found the manual override and yanked it. The bulkhead hissed open just as a shadow loomed at the far end of the passage. Go, she shouted, shoving Jax through the opening before diving in after him. The bulkhead sealed shut behind them, cutting off the screeches of the pursuing creature. They collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Remind me why I agreed to this again? Jax muttered. Because you have a conscience even if you pretend not to, she shot back, though the words lacked bite. Before either of them could say more, the comms crackled to life. Still alive? Drake's voice was strained but steady. Barely, Hannah replied, relief flooding through her. Are you okay? Took down one of them. Other one's on my tail. Where are you? Jax pulled out a data pad, syncing it with the station's internal map. We're in section Delta 4, near the auxiliary control room. Good. Stay put. I'll meet you there. Hannah frowned. Shouldn't we keep moving? No. You move, you make noise, and those things will find you faster than I can. Great, Jax muttered. So we're just sitting ducks now. But Drake had already cut the connection. For several tense minutes, they sat in silence, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the distant hum of the station's systems. Hannah's mind raced. She'd come here on a whim, a desperate need to do something, anything, but now, faced with the reality of it all, she felt hopelessly out of her depth. What's your plan, Hannah? Jax asked quietly. She shook her head. I don't know. I couldn't ignore that message. I couldn't let them die. And now you might die instead, he pointed out, though his tone lacked malice. Before she could respond, the bulkhead hissed open and Drake stumbled through. He was bleeding from a gash on his arm, his face pale but determined. Status? He asked curtly. Locked in a room with no plan, Jax replied dryly. Drake ignored him, turning to Hannah. You're good with tech, right? I guess, she stammered. He handed her a device, a small handheld computer with a cracked screen. This is what they're building out there. Some kind of signal amplifier. If we can figure out how it works, we might be able to shut it down. Or at least slow them down. She stared at the device, her stomach twisting. And if I can't? Then we die, Drake said bluntly. But hey, no pressure. Hannah sat cross-legged on the floor of the auxiliary control room, the biomechanical device in her lap. Her fingers moved frantically across the exposed circuitry, her multi-tool sparking as she peeled back layers of alien wiring. She wasn't sure what was more intimidating, the swarm outside or the fact that Drake was watching her like his life depended on it. Because it did. No pressure, she muttered under her breath, the words bitter. What was that? Drake asked, pacing near the door. Nothing, she shot back, trying to keep her focus. Her mind raced as she traced the circuits. The device pulsed faintly in her hands, its inner mechanisms unlike anything she'd ever seen before. Find anything useful? Drake pressed, leaning over her shoulder. Useful? Sure, she snapped, her voice tense. If you define useful as completely alien tech designed to dismantle the laws of physics. Give me 5 minutes and I'll tell you if I can use it or if it's going to blow up in my face. Drake raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping back to give her room. Jax, perched on a nearby console, watched her work with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. So, just to clarify, he said, you're hacking into a device made by a species we don't understand, with technology we've never seen before, in the hopes that it'll magically solve all our problems? Pretty much, Hannah replied without looking up. Great. I love those odds. Hannah ignored him, focusing instead on the strange patterns emerging in the circuitry. The device wasn't just transmitting a signal, it was creating one, a low-frequency hum that she could feel in her bones. It wasn't just communication. It was coordination. They're syncing up, she murmured, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? Drake asked. These creatures, she said, gesturing to the device, they're not acting individually. They're connected like a hive mind. This thing, it's amplifying their coordination. It's why they're so effective. They're not just reacting to us, they're anticipating us. Drake's jaw tightened. Can you disable it? Hannah hesitated, her hands hovering over the alien device. Maybe. But if I screw this up, it could send out a stronger signal instead. Or explode. I don't know. It's alien tech. Do it, Drake said firmly. She looked up at him, incredulous. Do you even hear yourself? We don't have a choice, he said. If we don't take out that signal, we're dead anyway. The longer we sit here, the more of them there'll be. So unless you've got a better idea, do it? Hannah swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she returned to the device. She didn't have time to second-guess herself. She rewired a few connections, isolating what she thought was the power source. Okay, she said, her voice shaky. I think I can shut it down, but we'll need to get closer to the source. Drake frowned. Closer? How close? Hannah hesitated. The amplifier isn't working alone. There's a central signal generator, probably near the rift itself. If we can get there, I can use this to disrupt it. Maybe even shut it down entirely. Jax groaned. Of course it's near the rift. Why wouldn't it be? Drake's expression was grim, but he nodded. Fine. We'll move out in 10. Grab what you need. The Star Stray was barely holding together by the time they reached the edge of the rift. Jax piloted the ship with a mixture of skill and sheer stubbornness, weaving through the swarm of biomechanical creatures. The closer they got to the rift, the more chaotic the battlefield became. Wreckage floated in every direction, some of it still glowing from recent explosions. This is insane, Jax muttered, gripping the controls. We're going to die. Not if I can help it, Drake said, strapping into the ship's gunner seat. Hannah sat in the co-pilot's chair, the alien device cradled in her arms. She couldn't stop staring at the rift. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. A swirling vortex of energy that seemed to defy reality itself. Are you sure about this? Jax asked her. No, she admitted. But if we don't try, they'll just keep spreading. Someone has to stop them. Jax sighed. You really suck at pep talks, you know that? Drake cut in over the comms. Heads up. We've got company. Hannah looked out the viewport and saw them, dozens of biomechanical creatures closing in fast. Can't you fly any faster? Drake barked. I'm not a miracle worker. Jax snapped back, throwing the ship into a sharp roll to avoid incoming fire. Drake opened fire, the ship's cannons lighting up the darkness. Several of the creatures exploded, but more took their place. They're everywhere. Hannah shouted. Hold on. Jax yelled, yanking the controls hard to the left. The Star Stray skidded through the chaos, narrowly avoiding a collision with a piece of drifting debris. The ship jolted violently as one of the creatures latched onto the hull. Get it off us, Jax shouted. Drake didn't need to be told twice. He swiveled the turret and fired point blank, blasting the creature off the ship. We're not going to last much longer, Jax called out. We're almost there, Hannah said, pointing to a structure near the rift. It was massive, a spire-like construct that seemed to pulse with the same energy as the alien device in her hands. That's it, she said. That's the source. Great, Jax muttered. Now how do we get to it without getting torn apart? Drake's voice came over the comms, cold and steady. We don't. You're going to drop me off. Hannah whipped around to look at him. What? You heard me, he said. I'll cover you while you get to the spire. Someone's got to keep these things off your back. That's suicide, she protested. Drake shrugged. Welcome to war. Wait a minute, Jax cut in. Why am I suddenly part of the plan to fly closer to the spire? I didn't sign up for this. You signed up when you didn't leave her behind, Drake said. Now shut up and fly. Jax groaned but didn't argue, pushing the Star Stray toward the spire. As they neared the structure, the swarm thickened. Drake jumped into the fray, his rifle blazing as he fought to buy them time. Hannah's heart raced as the Star Stray touched down near the base of the spire. She grabbed the alien device and bolted out of the ship, Jax reluctantly following with a blaster in hand. Go? Drake shouted over the comms. I'll hold them off. Hannah didn't look back. She sprinted toward the spire, the alien device humming in her hands. The entrance to the spire was an open, gaping maw of biomechanical material. It pulsed faintly as if alive. This is a terrible idea, Jax muttered, but he followed her inside. The interior was worse than Hannah had imagined. The walls were lined with tendrils of organic and metallic material, and the air was thick with an unnatural hum. The device in her hands pulsed in sync with the walls as if they were connected. This is it, she said, her voice trembling. The central node should be up ahead. You'd better be right about this, Jax said. They moved deeper into the spire, the hum growing louder with each step. Hannah's hands trembled as she adjusted the device, preparing to use it to disrupt the signal. They rounded a corner and found it, the central node. It was massive, a pulsating core of energy that seemed to radiate malevolence. Now what? Jax asked. Hannah took a deep breath. The central node pulsed like a living heart, casting an eerie glow across the chamber. Tendrils of biomechanical material snaked out from it, connecting to the walls, ceiling, and floor. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through Hannah's very bones. She clutched the alien device tightly, her mind racing. This is it, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Jax stood beside her, his blaster at the ready, though it looked pitifully inadequate against the monstrosity in front of them. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. I don't think we're alone anymore. As if on cue, a low, guttural screech echoed through the spire. Hannah turned to see shadows moving in the passage they'd just come through. The swarm had followed them inside. Fantastic, Jax muttered, raising his weapon. Hannah dropped to her knees in front of the central node, placing the alien device against its surface. The two seemed to recognize each other, the device lighting up in response to the node's pulsing glow. Come on, she whispered, her hands flying over the device's controls. She was improvising, working off half-guesses and sheer desperation. She rewired connections, redirected power, and tried to isolate the signal amplification process. The node shuddered, and the hum grew louder, almost as if it were fighting her. Hannah? Jax shouted, firing at one of the creatures as it lunged into the chamber. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. I'm trying, she snapped, sweat pouring down her face. Behind her, the battle was chaos. Jax fired wildly, each shot taking down one creature only for two more to take its place. The swarm was relentless, their red eyes glowing with a terrifying intelligence. Drake, we need backup. Jax yelled into the comm. The response crackled through, distorted but clear enough to make Hannah freeze. I'm pinned down. Can't reach you. Drake's voice was grim, but there was no fear in it. You're on your own. Make it count. Hannah clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't think about Drake or the swarm or the fact that they were almost certainly about to die. She had one job: stop the signal. The device in her hands sparked violently and she flinched. A warning indicator lit up on its surface, symbols flashing in a language she didn't understand. What now? Jax demanded, firing another shot. It's fighting back, she said through gritted teeth. The system's adaptive. It knows what I'm trying to do. Great, Jax said, blasting another creature. Tell it to adapt to being dead. Hannah ignored him, her hands moving faster than ever. She rerouted power through the device's core, bypassing the corrupted systems and forcing a direct overload. If she couldn't disable the signal cleanly, she'd have to brute force it. The node's pulsing grew erratic, its glow flickering. The hum in the air changed pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine that set Hannah's teeth on edge. It's working, she shouted. Define working. Jax yelled back, his voice barely audible over the noise. The creatures hesitated, their movements faltering. It was as if the node's disruption was affecting them directly. But the victory was short-lived. The central node began to writhe, its tendrils retracting and thrashing as if in pain. And then it started to pull energy inward. Hannah's eyes widened. Oh no. What do you mean, oh no? Jax demanded. It's going to blow, she yelled. Jax looked at the swarm, then back at her. Then let's go. Hannah hesitated. If they left now, the explosion might not destroy the entire system. The signal could re-establish itself and the swarm would rebuild. She had to make sure it was finished. You go, she said, her voice firm. What? Jax froze, disbelief written across his face. I need to stay and make sure it works, she said. If I leave now, it might recover. Go, Jax. You can still make it back to the ship. No way, he shouted. We're not doing this heroic self-sacrifice crap. Jax, go, she screamed, her voice cracking. For a moment he didn't move, his jaw tightening. But the swarm was already recovering, their movements growing more coordinated as the signal stabilized. Damn it, he growled. Fine. But if you survive, I'm never letting you live this down. He turned and ran, firing wildly to cover his retreat. Hannah took a deep breath, her hands steady now. She reconfigured the device one last time, redirecting all its power into the central node. The energy buildup was reaching critical levels, the glow becoming blinding. The creatures were closing in, their screeches deafening. Hannah ignored them, her entire focus on the device. For the galaxy, she whispered. The node exploded in a blinding flash of light, a shockwave ripping through the spire. When Hannah opened her eyes, everything was silent. She was lying on the cold, metallic floor of the spire, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning circuits. The central node was gone, reduced to a charred crater. The swarm was gone too. Their lifeless bodies littered the floor, their red eyes dark and empty. She coughed, every muscle in her body screaming in protest as she pushed herself to her feet. Her head was spinning, but she was alive. Hannah, do you copy? Drake's voice crackled through the calm. She fumbled for her earpiece. I'm here, she croaked. Thank God, he said, relief flooding his tone. What about the swarm? Gone, she said. The node's destroyed. There was a pause and then Drake said, You did it. You actually did it? The faint sound of footsteps made her turn. Jax was standing in the entrance to the chamber, his face pale but alive. Told you you'd survive, he said, though his voice was shaky. Hannah managed a weak smile. Barely. Jax helped her back to the Starstray where Drake was waiting. The ship was battered, the hull scorched and dented, but it still flew. As they left the spire behind, the rift began to collapse, its energy dissipating into the void. You saved the galaxy, Drake said quietly. Hannah shook her head. We saved it? Jax snorted. Yeah, but next time, can we save it without almost dying? Hannah leaned back in her seat, exhaustion washing over her. For the first time in days she felt a flicker of hope. The galaxy wasn't safe, not yet. But for now they'd won. And that was enough. The end.